The starship Nexus Prime hung in the darkness of space like a great metal flower, its docking rings spinning slowly as vessels from 100 different worlds came and went through its port's commander Vexter of the Krellin Dominion stood at the observation deck with his forearms crossed over his chest and his golden eyes narrowed with impatience as he watched another ship approach the station. He was tall even by Krellin standards, standing at nearly 8 feet with scales the color of burnished copper and a ridge of bone spines running from his forehead to the base of his skull. He had earned every medal that decorated his uniform through blood and conquest, and he had never known defeat in over 300 years of service to the Dominion today. He was here to witness something that he found both amusing and insulting at the same time. The Galactic Coalition had decided to grant full membership to yet another primitive species, and Vexter had been sent as the Krellin representative to observe the ceremony. He did not want to be here. He had better things to do than watch some backwater species receive honors they had not earned. But the High Command had insisted that he attend, and so here he stood, bored and irritated and counting the hours until he could return to his fleet. The ship that approached the station now was the one carrying the new species Vex. Tar leaned forward slightly and studied it with a fine eye and critical eye. It was a military vessel of some kind, angular and gray and bristling with weapons that looked primitive compared to Krellin technology. The design was functional but inelegant, built for purpose rather than beauty. He snorted softly through his nostrils and turned away from the window. His aide, a young Krellin named Torvex, stood nearby with a data tablet in his hands. "Commander," Torvex said, "the human delegation will dock in approximately 15 minutes, and the ceremony will begin 1 hour after that." "Humans," Vexter repeated the word with distaste. "Tell me about them." Torvex consulted his tablet and began to recite the information he had gathered. "They come from a small planet called Earth in a system on the outer edge of the spiral arm, and they have only possessed faster than light travel for approximately 200 years, which makes them one of the youngest spacefaring species in the Coalition." 200 years, Dexter laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal walls. "The Krellin Dominion has ruled the stars for 15,000 years, and these creatures think they belong at the same table as us. They have proven themselves capable fighters," Torvex continued. "They successfully defended their territory against the Vorn Raiders 3 years ago and drove them back with minimal outside assistance. The Vorn are scavengers and cowards." Vexter waved one of his hands dismissively. "Defeating them is nothing to boast about." He fell silent as the human ship completed its docking procedure and the airlock doors began to cycle open. Through the window he could see a group of figures emerging from the vessel, and he felt his lip curl in contempt as he got his first look at the species that the Coalition had deemed worthy of membership. They were so small, the tallest among them barely reached the height of his chest, and their bodies were soft and unarmored, covered in nothing but thin fabric uniforms. They had no scales, no claws, no natural weapons of any kind that he could see. Their skin came in various shades of brown and pink, and their heads were covered with thin strands of material that he assumed was some kind of fur. They walked on 2 legs and had only 2 arms, which Vexter found almost pitifully inadequate. Could a species survive with only 2 arms? The group was led by a female of the species, older than the others. If the gray coloring of her head fur was any indication, she wore a uniform covered in medals and ribbons, and she walked with a straight back and a steady stride that suggested she was someone of importance. Behind her came a group of soldiers in formal dress, their weapons holstered at their sides. These were the famous human warriors that the Coalition had spoken of with such respect. Vexter could not contain his amusement. "These are their elite fighters," he said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. They looked like prey animals waiting to be eaten. Several other alien dignitaries turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from disapproval to nervous agreement. The humans either did not hear him or chose not to respond. Female leader glanced in his direction for just a moment, and their eyes met across the crowded docking bay. Vexter expected to see fear or anger or shame in her gaze. Instead, he saw nothing but calm assessment. As if she were measuring him and finding him unremarkable, she inclined her head, slightly in what might have been acknowledgement or might have been dismissal. And then she turned away and continued walking toward the council chamber. Vexter felt a flash of irritation at being so casually ignored. He was a commander of the Krellan Dominion, and he had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds, while this creature's ancestors were still learning to build. Fierzy followed the crowd into the council chamber and took his assigned seat among the other dignitaries. The ceremony itself was long and tedious, filled with speeches about cooperation and unity and the bright future that awaited all members of the coalition. Vexter paid little attention. He spent most of the time studying the humans and cataloging their weaknesses. They had slow reflexes compared to Krellan's theory. Hearing was inferior to at least half the species in the room. They required more oxygen than most races and would suffocate in atmospheres that others found comfortable. They were fragile and short-lived, with natural lifespans of less than a century. In short, they were entirely unremarkable when the human leader, Admiral Chun as she was called, stepped forward to accept the coalition's offer of membership. Vexter listened to her speech with half an ear. She spoke of peace and partnership and the hope that humanity would prove itself worthy of the trust being placed in them. She was gracious and diplomatic and utterly boring. After the ceremony ended, Vexter made his way through the crowd toward the exit, eager to return to his ship and leave this place behind. As he passed near the human delegation, he paused and looked down at Admiral Chun with a smile that showed all of his fangs. "Welcome to the galaxy," he said. "Try not to get yourselves killed." Admiral Chun looked up at him with that same unreadable expression she had worn earlier. "Thank you for your concern," she replied. "We will do our best to survive." There was something in her voice that Vexter could not quite identify. Something that was not quite sarcasm and not quite threat, but somehow contained elements of both. He dismissed it as the posturing of a lesser species and walked away without another word. He would think of them no more. They were insignificant, a footnote in the long history of the galaxy, and they would fade into obscurity like so many other young races before them. He was certain of this. He was completely and utterly wrong. 3 months passed after the ceremony at Nexus Prime, and Commander Vexter had already forgotten about the humans entirely. He had returned to his duties with the Krellan fleet, patrolling the borders of Dominion space and maintaining order among the conquered worlds that fell under his jurisdiction. Life had returned to normal, and the memory of those small soft creatures faded from his mind like morning mist burned away by the sun. Then the reports began to arrive. At first they were just whispers. Rumors passed between ship captains and station commanders in hushed voices. Something was moving at the edge of the galaxy, something that had come from beyond the rim where no civilized species dared to venture. The early reports spoke of missing scout ships and silent colonies, of worlds that had gone dark without warning or explanation. The coalition dismissed these reports as binary exaggeration and superstition. The outer rim was a dangerous place full of natural hazards and uncharted phenomena, and ships went missing there all the time. There was no need for alarm then. The first refugees arrived. They came in battered ships with damaged engines, their faces hollow with fear and exhaustion. They spoke of a nightmare made flesh, of creatures that poured out of the darkness in numbers beyond counting. They called them the Hollow because that was what they did to everything they touched. They hollowed out worlds and consumed everything living upon them, leaving nothing behind but empty rock and silence. The Coalition finally took notice when 3-member worlds fell silent in a single week. A reconnaissance fleet was dispatched to investigate, and what they found sent shockwaves through every government in the galaxy. The Hollow were real, and they were coming. Commander Vexter received his orders on a cold morning aboard his flagship, the Crimson Fury. He was to take his fleet to the Verith system and establish a defensive position against the approaching enemy. The High Command believed that this was where the Hollow would strike next, and they wanted the finest warriors of the Dominion to meet them head-on. Vexter accepted the mission with pride and confidence. He had never faced an enemy he could not defeat, and he did not believe that these Hollow creatures would be any different. They were just another threat to be crushed, another obstacle to be overcome, another victory to add to his already legendary record. His fleet arrived at the Verith system 2 days later, and they took up positions around the inhabited moon that orbited the system's largest gas giant. The moon was home to nearly 3 million civilians from various Coalition species, and their safety was now in Krellin hands. Vexthar stood on the bridge of the Crimson Fury and surveyed his forces with satisfaction. 47 warships under his command, each one crewed by the finest soldiers the Dominion had to offer. They were armed with the most advanced weapons in the galaxy, protected by shields that could withstand direct hits from stellar weaponry. They were ready for anything. The Hollow arrived on the 3rd day. Thur was in his quarters reviewing tactical data when the alarm began to sound, a harsh wailing noise that echoed through every corridor of the ship. He made his way to the bridge at a run and arrived just in time to see the sensor display light up with contacts. So many contacts, they poured out of hyperspace like water through a broken dam. Ship after ship after ship appearing in the darkness until the display could barely keep track of them all. Vex Tar felt his confidence waver for the first time as he stared at the numbers scrolling across his screen. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands more than any fleet he had ever faced, more than he had ever imagined any single force could be. But he was Krellin, and Krellins did not show fear. All ships, he commanded, his voice steady and strong. Form defensive formation and prepare to engage. His fleet moved with practiced precision, arranging themselves into a wall of metal and firepower between the approaching enemy and the vulnerable moon behind them. The Hollow came on without hesitation or formation, a swarm rather than a fleet, driven by instinct rather than strategy. The first shots were fired when the enemy entered weapons range, and for a brief moment, Vexthar allowed himself to hope his ships struck true, and Hollow vessels exploded in balls of flame that lit up the void. But for every ship they destroyed, 10 more took its place. The Hollow did not stop. They did not slow down or change course or show any sign that they noticed their losses at all. They simply kept coming, an endless tide of hunger and destruction that crashed against the Krellin formation. Like waves against a crumbling shore, the battle lasted for 3 hours, and every minute of it was a nightmare. Vexthar watched his fleet being torn apart around him. Ships that had survived 100 battles reduced to burning wreckage in moments. He saw the Hollow boarding vessels, their creatures pouring through breached hulls to slaughter the crews. Inside he heard the screams of his soldiers dying over the communication channels. Brave warriors who had never known fear, facing something that made their courage meaningless. He ordered a fighting retreat, and then simply a retreat, and then around his beautiful fleet. The pride of the Dominion scattered and fled in all directions as the Hollow continued their relentless advance. 17 of his 47 ships escaped the initial engagement. 17 out of 47, the Crimson Fury was among the survivors. But the ship had taken terrible damage and was barely capable of limping. Away from the battle, Vexter sat in his command chair and stared at the sensor display with empty eyes as the Hollow ignored his fleeing vessels and continued toward the moon. 3 million civilians, 3 million lives that he had sworn to protect. He had failed. Then all his communications officer spoke up, his voice trembling with barely contained terror. "Commander, we are receiving a distress signal, and it has been broadcast across all Coalition emergency channels." "Who would respond?" Vexter asked, and his voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Who could possibly make a difference now?" The officer checked his console and then looked up with an expression of confusion. "The nearest fleet that has acknowledged our distress call is human." Vexter remembered the small soft creatures from the ceremony 3 months ago, and he felt something that might have been bitter laughter rising in his chest. Humans of all the species in the galaxy, the ones coming to their rescue were the weakest and most primitive of them. It was almost funny. It was the final joke of a universe that had already taken everything from him. "How long until they arrive?" he asked. "Approximately 4 hours at maximum speed." 4 hours, the moon would be consumed in 2. It did not matter. Anyway, humans would take one look at what they were facing and run just as the Krellans had run. That was the only sensible option. That was what any rational species would do. Vexter closed his eyes and waited for the end. The human fleet arrived earlier than expected. Vexter was still sitting in his command chair, staring at nothing and waiting for the inevitable, when his sensor officer shouted in surprise, "Commander, hyperspace signatures detected, and they are coming in fast." Vexter opened his eyes and looked at the display without much interest. What difference did it make? The humans would see the hollow swarm and they would turn and run, just as anyone with any sense would. No fleet in the galaxy could stand against those numbers. The ships emerged from hyperspace in a flash of distorted light, and Vexter counted them as they appeared: 32 vessels, 32 human warships. Against a swarm of thousands, it was suicide. It was madness. It was exactly what he had expected from such a young and foolish species. He opened a communication channel to warn them, feeling that he owed them at least that much. Even prey animals did not deserve to die in ignorance of what they faced. The face that appeared on his screen was familiar. It was Admiral Chun, the same gray-haired female who had led the human delegation at Nexus Prime 3 months ago. She looked older somehow. Or perhaps it was just the harsh lighting of her bridge that made the lines on her face seem deeper. "Commander Vexter," she said, and her voice was calm and controlled. "We received your distress signal, and we are here to assist." "Admiral," Vexter replied, and he was surprised to find that he felt something like genuine concern for these creatures. "You need to withdraw immediately, and there is nothing you can do here, and if you engage the Hollow, you will be destroyed." Chun did not seem surprised by his words. She simply nodded slightly as if he had confirmed something she already knew. "We've assessed the situation," she said. "We understand the odds. Then you understand that this is hopeless. I understand that there are 3 million civilians on that moon who will die if we do nothing." Vexter shook his head slowly. "They will die regardless of what you do. And all you will accomplish by staying is adding your own deaths to the toll." Admiral Chun was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that Vexter had never heard from any species in all his centuries of life. It was not bravery, exactly. Though there was courage in it, it was not defiance. Though there was steel in it, it was something deeper and stranger, something that he lacked the words to describe. "Commander," she said, "I want you to get your surviving ships to the rear and begin evacuation procedures for as many civilians as you can carry. And we will buy you time." "You cannot buy time against the Hollow," Vexter protested. "They do not stop and they do not slow down, and they will go through you like you are nothing." then we will be nothing for as long as we can manage it. She cut the communication channel before he could respond. Vexthor sat frozen in his chair, unable to believe what he was witnessing. The human fleet was not running. They were not even holding position at a safe distance to observe the enemy. They were accelerating directly toward the hollow swarm, engines burning at full power, weapon systems powering up for engagement. "Commander," his tactical officer said, and there was something like awe in his voice. "They are heading straight for the center of the enemy formation. I can see that." Vexthor replied. He watched the human ships grow smaller on the display as they raced toward their doom. And he felt something stirring in his chest that he barely recognized. He had called them prey animals. He had laughed at their soft bodies and their short lives and their primitive technology. He had dismissed them as insignificant creatures who had no place among the great powers of the galaxy, and now those insignificant creatures were flying to their deaths so that his people might have a chance to live. "Helm," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion he could not name. "Take us to the moon and begin civilian evacuation immediately, and signal all surviving Krellin vessels to do the same." "Yes, Commander." The Crimson Fury turned away from the colonel. Battle and limped toward the moon on damaged Anginus. Vexthor remained facing the tactical display, watching the humans close the distance to the enemy swarm. He should have been focusing on the evacuation. He should have been coordinating his surviving ships and calculating how many civilians they could save. Instead, he could not look away from the 32 human vessels that were about to throw themselves into the fire. The first shots were exchanged when the fleets came within. Weapons-range human missiles streaked through the void and found their targets. Hollow ships bursting apart in silent explosions, but the swarm barely seemed to notice. They turned toward the human fleet like a single organism. Thousands of vessels orienting on this new threat. The humans did not slow down. They did not change course or pull back to a defensive position. They dove straight into the heart of the swarm, with weapons blazing and shields flickering under the impact of countless enemy attacks. Vexthor watched a human destroyer take a direct hit that should have destroyed it instantly. The ship staggered and listed to one side, trailing fire and atmosphere from a wound in its hull. But it did not stop. It kept flying and kept fighting, its remaining weapons still tracking and firing, even as the vessel died around it. Another human ship moved to cover the damaged destroyer, interposing itself between its wounded ally and the enemy. Both ships continued to advance. "What are they doing?" Vexthor whispered to himself. "Why do they not retreat?" He had seen bravery before. He had fought alongside many species who valued courage and honor in battle, but this was something different. This was not bravery as he understood it. This was something that looked almost like insanity. A complete and utter refusal to acknowledge the reality of their situation. They were dying. They had to know they were dying. Yet they kept fighting, as if death was simply another obstacle to be overcome. The tactical display updated as more human ships fell, their icons winking out one by one as the hollow swarm engulfed them. But for every human ship that died, dozens of hollow vessels died with it. The humans were not going quietly. They were making the enemy pay for every inch of space, every second of time, every life they took. Vexthor realized that his hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his claws had punctured the material. He forced himself to relax and turned to his communications officer. "Open a channel to the human fleet," he ordered. "I want to hear their communications." "Yes, Commander." A moment later, the bridge was filled with the sounds of human voices. And what Vexthor heard changed everything. He thought he knew about the species he had dismissed as prey. They were not screaming, they were not crying or begging or despairing, they were laughing. They were joking with each other even as their ships burned around them, making dark humor out of their own impending deaths. He heard a pilot call out target coordinates to her wingmate, and then add a comment about owing him a drink when this was over. He heard a captain order his crew to abandon ship and then refuse to leave the bridge himself so he could keep the weapons firing until the very end. Heard soldiers telling each other to hold the line, to give the civilians time to escape, to make every shot count. He heard them dying, and they died with words of encouragement on their lips. Hold the line, a voice repeated over and over. Hold the line and give them time. Just hold the line. Vexthor listened, and for the first time in 300 years, he felt something that might have been shame. The evacuation of the moon was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Vexthor directed his surviving ships to the surface and watched as millions of terrified civilians poured into every vessel that could carry them. Krellin warships that had been designed for combat were packed with refugees from a dozen different species. Their cargo holds and corridors and even weapons bays filled with huddled bodies. Through it all, the sound of human voices continued to fill the bridge, their communications still playing over the speakers as Vexthor refused to shut them off. He needed to hear. He needed to understand. Battle had been raging for nearly an hour now, and the human fleet had been reduced to less than half its original strength. 15 ships remained active on the tactical display, their icons surrounded by the red markers of the enemy swarm. They should have been overwhelmed by now. They should have been destroyed in the first 10 minutes, but they were still fighting. The humans had done something that Vexthor had never seen before. Instead of trying to hold a single defensive line, they had scattered into smaller groups and begun hunting the hollow vessels like pack predators. They would strike from unexpected angles, destroy a cluster of enemy ships, and then pull back before the swarm could respond when the hollow pursued them. Other human ships would hit the pursuers from behind. It was a strategy of constant movement and calculated aggression, trading ground for damage and time for lives. The civilian evacuation ships were already beginning to lift off from the moon, their engines straining under the weight of far more passengers than they were designed to carry. Every minute the humans bought with their blood was another ship escaping, another 1,000 lives saved, another small victory against the overwhelming darkness. Vexthor watched a human cruiser named the Defiance take position between the evacuation corridor and a group of hollow vessels that had broken through the defensive screen. The ship was already badly damaged, its port side torn open and venting atmosphere, but it held its ground and fired everything it had at the approaching enemy. The hollow ships returned fire, and the Defiance began to come apart under the assault. Its captain came over the communication channel, his voice strained but steady. "This is Captain Morrison of the Defiance to any human vessels in range, and we are taking heavy fire and losing structural integrity, and we cannot hold this position much longer." Another voice responded immediately. "Defiance, this is the Indomitable, and we are on our way to support. So just hold on. Negative Indomitable, and you are needed elsewhere. And we can handle this." There was a pause, and then Captain Morrison spoke again. "All hands, this is the captain, and I am ordering all non-essential personnel to the escape pods immediately." And that is not a suggestion. Vexthor listened as the sounds of the ship falling apart grew louder in the background. He heard bulkheads collapsing and atmosphere screaming out through hull breaches. He heard the captain giving orders to his remaining crew, directing fire and damage control with a calm voice that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The Defiance held its position for another 7 minutes. 7 minutes of burning and dying and refusing to move when it finally broke apart. Its weapons were still firing. The escape pods launched just before the end, small specks of metal and life shooting away from the dying ship and racing toward the evacuation corridor. Vexthor counted them as they fled, 43 pods out of a crew of over 300. Only 43 pods made it out. Captain Morrison was not among the survivors. He had stayed on the bridge until the very end, holding the line until there was nothing left to hold. Another human ship moved to fill the gap left by the Defiance before the wreckage had even stopped glowing. The fighting continued without pause, without mercy, without any sign of surrender or retreat. Vexter found himself leaning forward in his chair, unable to look away from the tactical display. Had seen courage before. He had witnessed acts of bravery that would be remembered for generations, but he had never seen anything like this. The humans were not fighting because they thought they could win. They were not fighting for glory or honor or conquest. They were fighting because there were people behind them who would die if they stopped. And that was reason enough. That was the only reason they needed. A new voice came over the communication channel, and Vexter recognized it as Admiral Chun. All ships, this is the Admiral, and I want a status report from every vessel that can still fight. The responses came in one by one, and each one was worse than the last. Engines failing, weapons offline, hull breaches on multiple decks, casualties mounting by the minute. The picture they painted was grim. Human fleet was dying, and everyone knew it. But when the last report had been given, Admiral Chun did not order a retreat. She did not suggest that perhaps they had done enough and could withdraw with honor. Instead, she said 5 words that Vexter would remember for the rest of his very long life. Then we keep fighting. Anyway, and they did. They kept fighting as their ships fell apart around them. They kept fighting as friends and comrades died in the darkness of space. They kept fighting even when there was no logical reason to continue, even when any rational species would have accepted that the battle was lost. The humans did not seem to understand the concept of acceptable losses. Every life was worth fighting for. Every minute was worth dying. Fourth, last evacuation ship lifted off from the moon. 3 hours after the battle began, Vexter watched it rise into the sky and join the convoy of vessels fleeing towards safety. Its holds packed with the final group of refugees. Million civilians. They had saved 3 million civilians. The cost had been terrible beyond measure, but they had done the impossible. Now there was no reason for the humans to keep fighting. The civilians were safe. The mission was complete, and they could withdraw with the knowledge that their sacrifice had meant something. Vexithar opened a channel to the human fleet, expecting to hear Admiral Chun order the retreat. Instead, he heard her rallying her remaining forces for another assault on the hollow swarm. The evacuation convoy needs time to reach safe distance, she said. We hold here until they are clear. They were going to keep fighting. They were going to keep dying, not for the civilians on the moon, who were already saved, but for the civilians in the convoy, who might be caught if the hollow broke through too quickly. Vexthar closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he opened a channel to his surviving ships, all Krellin vessels. He said, "This is Commander Vexthar, and we are returning to the battle." The shocked silence that followed his words was almost comical. "Commander," his first officer said carefully, "our ships are badly damaged, and we are carrying civilian refugees. And we cannot possibly make a difference against those numbers." "We can make some difference," Vexthar replied. "And right now some difference is all that matters." He turned the Crimson Fury around and headed back toward the sounds of battle. And one by one his remaining ships followed him into the fire. The journey back to Coalition space took 3 days. 3 days of limping through the void on damaged engines, surrounded by the battered remnants of 2 fleets that had somehow survived the impossible. Vexthar spent most of that time on the bridge of the Crimson Fury, watching and listening and trying to understand the species that had changed everything he thought he knew about the galaxy. The human ships traveled alongside the Krellin vessels, and their crews worked together to make repairs and tend to the wounded. Vexthar had expected the humans to keep to themselves, to maintain the professional distance that most species preferred after a battle instead. They reached out. Human engineers crossed between ships to help with repairs, bringing tools and expertise that proved surprisingly effective despite their supposedly primitive technology. Human medics offered their services to Krellin wounded, adapting their treatments to alien physiology with a flexibility that impressed even the most skeptical. Krellin physicians, human captains, opened channels to share information and coordinate efforts, treating the Krellins as allies rather than strangers they had rescued. It was not what Vexter had expected. Nothing about these humans was what he had expected on the second day of the journey. Admiral Chun requested permission to come aboard the Crimson for Vexter granted it immediately. Curious to speak with her in person after everything that had happened, she arrived via shuttle, accompanied by 2 guards who looked as exhausted as everyone else. Her uniform was stained and torn, and there was a bandage wrapped around her left arm that she had clearly refused to let the medics replace with something less conspicuous. She looked like a warrior who had just walked through fire. Vexter met her at the airlock and escorted her to his personal quarters, dismissing his own guards with a wave of his hand. This conversation would be private, Admiral, he said, gesturing to a chair that had been designed for Krellin bodies, but would serve well enough for a human. Please sit, and you look like you need the rest. Chen smiled slightly and lowered herself into the chair with a wince that she tried to hide. Thank you, Commander. And I admit that the last few days have been challenging. Challenging, Vexter repeated, and there was something like awe in his voice. Admiral, you just fought a battle that should have been impossible to survive, and you lost 2/3 of your fleet, and you call it challenging. What else would I call it? Vexter sat down across from her and studied her face. She looked old. He realized not old by Krellin standards, of course, but old for a human. The lines around her eyes were deep, and the gray in her hair had spread since he had first seen her at Nexus Prime. She had probably been fighting battles like this for most of her adult life. I want to understand, he said finally. I have been trying to understand since the moment your fleet dropped out of hyperspace and charged into that swarm. And I still do not have an answer. What do you want to understand? Why you came? And why you stayed? And why you kept fighting when any rational species would have retreated? And why your people seem to treat death as nothing more than an inconvenience? Chun was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. I am not sure I can explain it in a way that would make sense to someone who has not lived among humans. And it is not something we were taught or programmed with. And it is just who we are. That is not an answer. No. But it is the truth. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, and her eyes seemed to be focused on something far away. We are a young species, Commander, and we know that, and we have not been part of galactic civilization for very long. And we are not the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. And yet you fight as if you believe you can defeat anything. It is not about believing we can win, Chun said. It is about believing that the fight matters even if we lose. She looked at him again, and there was something in her eyes that Vexter had never seen in any species. It was not courage. Though courage was part of it, it was not stubbornness. Though that was there too, it was something deeper. Something that seemed to burn in the very core of her being. We have a saying on Earth, she continued. It comes from a very old story about a battle that our ancestors fought thousands of years ago. A battle they knew they could not win. What happened in this battle? They died, all of them. But they held their ground for 3 days against an army that outnumbered them hundreds to 1. And they gave their allies time to regroup and eventually win the war. And the saying, Chun smiled, come back with your shield. Or on it. Vexter considered this for a moment. I do not understand. Shields were heavy, Chun explained. If you ran from a battle, you would drop your shield because it slowed you down. So coming back with your shield meant you had stood and fought. And coming back on it meant you had died fighting and your comrades had carried your body home. So the saying means victory or death. It means that retreat is not an option. That you fight until you win or until you fall. And that either outcome is acceptable as long as you never give up. Vexthur sat in silence, processing this information. It was a philosophy that seemed almost insane to him. A rejection of the basic survival instincts that every species in the galaxy shared, and yet he had seen it in action. He had seen human ships throw themselves into impossible situations without hesitation. He had seen human soldiers die laughing because they knew their deaths had meant something. He had seen a species that treated survival as a secondary concern to duty and honor and protecting those who could not protect themselves. Your species is terrifying, Admiral. Chun laughed. And it was a genuine laugh, warm and tired and somehow comforting. We get that a lot. I mean it as a compliment. I know you do, Commander. And I accept it as one. She stood up slowly, favoring her wounded arm, and extended her hand toward him. Vexthur looked at the small pale hand for a moment, unsure what the gesture meant. It is a human greeting, Chun explained. You take my hand in yours and we shake, and it is a sign of respect and friendship. Vexthur reached out with one of his 4 hands and carefully wrapped his clawed fingers around her. Much smaller ones. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Friends then, he said. Friends, she agreed. And allies, if the Dominion is willing. After what I witnessed at Vareth, the Dominion will be very willing indeed. The return of the Krullan fleet was not expected, Admiral. Chun's voice came over the communication channel with a note of surprise that Vexthur had never heard from her before. Commander Vexthur, what are you doing back here? And you should be escorting the evacuation convoy to safety. The convoy has enough escorts. Vexthur replied. And you do not have enough ships. There was a pause. And when Chun spoke again, there was something warm in her voice, despite the chaos of battle around them. Then welcome back, Commander, and try to keep up. The Krullan ships joined the human formation, their damaged weapons adding what firepower they could to the desperate defense. Vexthur found himself fighting alongside the very species he had mocked and dismissed, and he discovered that he had never been prouder to stand with anyone in all. In centuries of war, the humans did not fight like Krullans. They did not rely on superior firepower or overwhelming force. Instead, they fought with a flexibility and creativity that Vexthur found almost disturbing. They adapted to every new threat, almost instantly, changing tactics and formations as the situation demanded. When the Hollow tried to flank them, the humans were already moving to counter. When the swarm concentrated its forces for a massive assault, the humans scattered and reformed somewhere else. They treated the battle like a living thing, reading its movements and responding with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. But what impressed Vexthur most was not their tactics, it was their endurance. The humans had been fighting for hours now. Their ships were battered and burning. Their crews were exhausted and wounded. They'd watched friends die and had kept fighting anyway, and still they did not break. A human destroyer called the Resolute found itself surrounded by a group of hollow vessels, cut off from the rest of the fleet with no hope of rescue. Vexthur watched its icon on the tactical display, expecting to see it try to fight its way free or surrender to the inevitable. Instead, the Resolute did something that made him gasp aloud. It accelerated directly toward the largest hollow ship in the group. Engines burning at maximum power, the human captain came over the communication channel, his voice remarkably calm for a man who was about to die. This is Captain Williams of the Resolute to all ships, and we have lost main weapons and engines are failing, and we are going to make our deaths count. The Resolute struck the hollow command ship at full speed, and both vessels vanished in a ball of fire that lit up the void for miles around. The surrounding hollow ships suddenly without coordination, fell into confusion and scattered. It was the first time Vexter had seen the holo display anything like uncertainty, and the humans noticed Admiral Chen immediately ordered her remaining ships to exploit the gap, and they poured through the opening that the Resolute had created with its sacrifice. The holo swarm, for all its numbers, seemed to rely on its command ships for direction. Without them, the individual vessels became hesitant and disorganized. The humans began targeting the command ships specifically, hunting them through the chaos of battle and destroying them one by one. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it was working. The swarm was beginning to fragment. Individual holo vessels broke away from the main formation and fled back toward the galactic rim, their hunger apparently not strong enough to overcome their sudden fear. More and more of them retreated as the battle continued, until finally the great swarm that had seemed so invincible was reduced to scattered remnants. The battle was not won. The holo were not defeated, but they had been stopped. They had been shown that the galaxy would not be consumed without a fight. And that fight had been more costly than they had anticipated. As the last of the enemy vessels disappeared into hyperspace, a strange silence fell over the battlefield. Vexta looked at the tactical display and counted the surviving ships of the 32 human vessels that had entered the battle. Only 9 remained of his own 17 ships. Only 6 had survived. The wreckage of the others drifted through space, silent monuments to the price of victory. But victory it was. The evacuation convoy had reached safe distance. 3 million civilians would live to see another day, and the holo had learned that there were species in this galaxy who would not run, who would not surrender, who would fight until their last breath for people they had never met. Admiral Chun's flagship, the Unconquered, was barely holding together. Its hull was scarred with dozens of impact craters, and entire sections had been vented to space, but its engines still worked, and its communication array was still functional. And that was enough. Commander Vexter. Chun's voice came over the channel, and she sounded as exhausted as Vexter felt. I want to thank you for coming back, and your ships made a difference in the final push. Vexter shook his head slowly. Even though she could not see him, Admiral, it is I who should be thanking you, and I owe you an apology as well. An apology for what? For underestimating your people, and for calling you prey animals, and for believing that you had no place among the great powers of the galaxy. There was a soft laugh on the other end of the channel. Commander, you would not be the first to make that mistake, and you will not be the last. Perhaps not. But I will make sure that the Krellin Dominion knows what I witnessed here today, and I will make sure that no Krellin ever makes that mistake again. The channel fell silent for a moment, and when Chun spoke again, her voice was softer. We are not monsters, Commander, and we are not trying to prove anything to anyone, and we just do what needs to be done. That is exactly what makes you terrifying, Admiral. Dexter leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He had lived for 300 years. He had fought in more battles than he could count, had seen wonders and horrors beyond imagination. But he had never seen anything like the humans. He had never met a species that treated certain death as merely an inconvenience, that laughed in the face of impossible odds, that sacrificed themselves so readily for strangers they would never know. He understood now why the Coalition had welcomed them. He understood why even the older and more powerful species treated them with a respect that seemed out of proportion to their technology and resources. The humans were not dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they did not know how to give up, and that, Vexter realized, was the most terrifying power in the universe. The combined fleet arrived at the Coalition capital station to a welcome that Vexter had never experienced in all his years of service. Word of the Battle of Vareth had spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel, carried by emergency communications and refugee accounts and the frantic reports of government officials who could barely believe What they were hearing, the hollow had been stopped a swarm that should have consumed. An entire system had been turned back by a force that was outnumbered 100 to 1, and the species that had made it possible was not the mighty Krellin Dominion or the ancient Velthari Empire or any of the other great powers that had ruled the stars for millennia. It was the humans, the small soft creatures that Vexter had dismissed as prey animals, the newcomers, who had been granted coalition membership as a courtesy, rather than a recognition of their strength. Those humans the docking bays were crowded with representatives from every member species, all of them waiting to see the heroes of Verath with their own eyes. Vexter walked alongside Admiral Chun as they made their way through the press of bodies, and he noticed how the crowd parted for the human delegation with a respect that bordered on reverence. Chun accepted the attention with grace, but without pride. She simply nodded to those who greeted her and kept moving toward the council chamber, where the coalition leadership was waiting. The council session that followed was unlike anything Vexter had ever witnessed. One by one, the leaders of the great powers rose to speak, and every one of them offered praise and gratitude for what the humans had done. The Velthari Patriarch, whose species had looked down on humanity since their first contact, formally apologized for any insults his people had given over the years. The Consortium of Free Worlds offered the humans preferential trade agreements and access to technologies that had been restricted from younger species. The Krellin High Command, represented by a holographic projection of the Supreme Commander himself, announced that the Dominion would consider humanity a protected ally, and that any attack on human territory would be treated as an attack on the Dominion itself. Chun accepted all of these honors with the same calm dignity she had shown throughout the battle. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood before the assembled representatives of 100 worlds and said something that shocked them all. We did not fight at Verath for recognition or reward, and we did not sacrifice our people to gain political advantage or favorable treaties, and we simply did what needed to be done. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of species that had dismissed humanity for generations. There were people in danger, and we had the ability to help, and that is all the reason we needed. And it is all the reason we will ever need. If the Hollow return, we will fight them again. And if another threat emerges, we will face that too. And we will do these things not because we expect gratitude, but because it is right. That is who we are. And that is who we will always be. The chamber was silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Then the Krellin Supreme Commander's hologram began to applaud, his four hands clapping together in a gesture of respect that he had never shown to any non-Krellin in recorded history. The other delegates joined in, and soon the entire chamber was filled with the sound of 100 different species expressing their approval in their own ways. Vex Tar stood at the back of the room and watched with something like wonder. He had seen the birth of something new today. The humans had not just proven themselves as warriors, they had demonstrated a philosophy that was entirely foreign to the cold calculations of galactic politics. They believed in doing the right thing simply because it was right, regardless of cost or consequence. And now that philosophy was spreading, Vexathar could see it in the faces of the delegates around him. The sudden realization that perhaps there was another way to navigate the dangers of the universe. Perhaps strength was not just about firepower and numbers. Perhaps true power came from something deeper. After the formal session ended, Vexter sought out Admiral Chun for what he suspected would be their final private conversation. She was standing on an observation deck overlooking the station's main docking bay, watching as her remaining ships underwent repairs. "Admiral," he said as he approached, "I wanted to speak with you before you returned to human space. She turned to face him, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that she had not allowed anyone to see during the council session. "Of course, Commander. What is on your mind?" "I am writing my official report on the Battle of Vareth, and I wanted to make sure I described what happened accurately. And I fear that mere words may not be sufficient to capture what your people accomplished." Chun shook her head slowly. "We did not accomplish anything extraordinary, Commander. And we just refused to give up. That is exactly what was extraordinary, Admiral. And I have fought battles across half the galaxy, and I have never seen anything like what your people did at Vareth. And I doubt I ever will again." "You may be surprised," Chun said. "Humanity is full of people who would have done exactly what we did, given the same situation, and there is nothing special about us. And we are just stubborn." Vexter laughed. A genuine laugh that surprised even himself. "If that is what you call stubbornness, then I hope to never be on the receiving end of it." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I want you to know that I have learned something these past few days. And I have learned that strength takes many forms. And the Krellin Dominion has always believed that power comes from size, and technology, and numbers. But you showed me another kind of power, and it is the power of will, and the power of refusing to accept defeat, and the power of caring for others more than you care for yourself." Chun smiled, and for a moment she looked less tired. "That is a good lesson to learn, Commander. It is. And I will make sure that my people learn it too. And humanity has earned more than our respect today, and you have earned our friendship. And I do not say that lightly." He extended one of his hands toward her in the voice, human gesture she had taught him. She took it and shook firmly. "Then I hope this is the beginning of a long alliance," she said. "It will be," Vexter promised. "I will make certain of it." They stood together on the observation deck for a while longer, watching the ships come and go, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with words. Sometimes understanding did not require language. Sometimes it was enough simply to stand beside someone who had proven themselves worthy of respect, and that was exactly what the humans had done. 5 years passed after the Battle of Vareth. Galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted, and much of that change could be traced back to a single moment when a small fleet of human ships had refused to run from certain death. The Hollow had not returned intelligence. Reports suggested that they had retreated beyond the galactic rim, licking their wounds and reconsidering their belief that the galaxy would be easy. Some analysts believed they would come back eventually, stronger and more numerous than before. Others hoped that the lesson they had learned at Vareth would keep them away forever. Either way, the galaxy had time to prepare, and that time had been bought with human blood. Commander Vexter had been promoted 3 times since the battle, and he now held the rank of Grand Admiral, one of the highest positions in the Krellin Dominion. His report on the Battle of Vareth had become required reading at every military academy in Krellin space, and his description of human fighting spirit had changed how an entire generation of Krellin warriors thought about their place in the universe. He was on his way to Earth now, traveling aboard a diplomatic vessel rather than a warship. The humans had invited representatives from all the major powers to attend a memorial ceremony on the 5th anniversary of the battle, and Vexter had requested the honor of representing the Dominion personally. The ship dropped out of hyperspace in the Sol system, and Vexter got his first look at the human homeworld through the observation windows. It was a small planet, blue and green and white, orbiting a yellow star that was entirely unremarkable by galactic standards. It looked fragile somehow, as if a strong wind could blow it away, and yet this tiny world had produced a species that had stood against the Hollow and refused to break. The shuttle that carried him down to the surface landed in a city called Geneva, where the memorial ceremony would be held. Vexter had studied human culture extensively since the battle, but nothing had prepared him for the experience of walking through their streets surrounded by their buildings and their art and their daily lives. They were so small that was still the first thing he noticed about them even after everything that had happened. His initial impression remained accurate. Humans were small and soft and fragile, but now he understood that those physical characteristics meant nothing. The memorial was held in a vast plaza that had been constructed specifically for this occasion. At its center stood a monument, a pillar of black stone that rose toward the sky like an accusing finger. Carved into its surface were the names of every human who had died at Vareth. Hundreds and hundreds of names that would never be forgotten. Vexer stood among the crowd of alien dignitaries and watched as the human families filed past the monument, touching the names of their loved ones and whispering words that were not meant to be heard by anyone else. He saw parents who had lost children. He saw children who had lost parents. He saw the weight of grief that had been carried for 5 years and would be carried for generations more. Yet there was no anger in their faces. There was no resentment toward the Krellans who had fled the battle or the coalition who had been too slow to send reinforcements. There was only quiet pride and a determination to remember those who had fallen. Admiral Chun was there, older now but still straight-backed and clear-eyed. She had retired from active service 2 years after the battle, but she remained a powerful voice in human politics and a symbol of what her species could accomplish when pushed to the limit. She saw Vexther in the crowd and made her way toward him, and they greeted each other with the handshake that had become their tradition. "Grand Admiral," she said, "I am glad you could come. I would not have missed this for anything, Admiral. And these were my comrades as much as yours, and I stand here to honor their memory." Chun nodded, and there was something in her eyes that might have been tears. They would have appreciated that. The ceremony began with a moment of silence, and Vexther bowed his head along with everyone else. Then the speakers began. Human officials and military leaders who shared stories of courage and sacrifice that made even the hardened Krellan warrior feel something stirring in his chest. When it was Vexther's turn to speak, he walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd of humans and aliens who had gathered to remember. "I came here 5 years ago to mock your species," he said, and his voice carried across the plaza. "I called you prey animals, and I laughed at your warriors, and I believed that you had no place among the great powers of the galaxy." He paused and let the words sink in. "I was wrong. I was more wrong than I have ever been about anything in my 300 years of life. What I witnessed at Vareth changed me, and it changed the Krellan Dominion, and it changed the galaxy itself. And it taught us all a lesson that we will never forget. Strength is not about size or technology or numbers, and true strength comes from the heart. And it comes from the willingness to stand and fight for what is right, even when the odds are impossible." The humans who died at Vareth did not die because they were foolish or reckless, and they died because they refused to abandon people who needed their help. And they died because they believe that some things are worth dying for. That is a kind of strength that cannot be measured or quantified. And it is a kind of strength that the Hollow could not understand. And it is a kind of strength that the galaxy desperately needs. He turned to face the monument with all its carved names. "To those who fell at Vareth, I say this, and you are heroes, and you are legends, and you will never be forgotten. And the Krellan Dominion honors your sacrifice and pledges to stand beside humanity for as long as the stars burn in the sky." He stepped back from the podium, and the plaza erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very ground. Later, after the ceremony had ended and the crowds had begun to disperse, Vexther found himself alone at the base of the monument. He reached out with one clawed hand and touched the cold black stone, tracing the letters of names he could not pronounce but would always remember. "I was a fool," he said quietly to the dead. "But you taught me to be better, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the lesson you gave me." He stood there for a long time, a giant alien warrior paying homage to the small brave creatures who had shown him what true power really meant. And somewhere in the galaxy, the Hollow waited and wondered if they would ever be brave enough to return to a universe that contained such terrifying monsters as humanity. They decided that perhaps they would not. Some prey, they had learned, was not worth hunting. Some prey would hunt you back, and the humans, above all others, would never stop fighting until the very last one of them had fallen. That was their greatest strength. That was what made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. That was why the stars themselves would learn to fear them.